I'm Rick Harp. This is your APTN News Brief for Thursday, February 1st. The family of a Manitoba woman whose body was found 17 years ago say they now have closure following the recent news of charges in her death. A welcome development marked at a vigil in Winnipeg. Tamara Pimentel has more.
It's been nearly 17 years since the death of 24-year-old Crystal Saunders. At the Mama Wichita Center in Winnipeg, many gathered around a sacred fire with the sounds of Métis fiddling to honor her and offer supports to her family. Cynthia Roulette is the grandmother to Saunders' cousins and remembers her as playful and bubbly. She says she often relives the day she found out about Saunders' death.
I said, oh my God. Like, this isn't happening. It can't be happening. Like, the little girl that I saw in the coffin wasn't the Crystal that I knew. And I'm sorry I ever went up to the coffin because that isn't what I wanted to remember her as.
In April 2007, Saunders was last seen by a Winnipeg police officer getting into a vehicle on Sargent and Sherbrooke Street in Winnipeg's West End. RCMP found her body the next morning in a ditch near St. Ambrose. DNA was found on Crystal's remains, and due to advancements in technology, that DNA linked to Kevin Q. Last week, Q was charged with second-degree murder for Saunders' death. The news her family waited almost 2 decades to hear.
When I heard it, it was like I could scream, like with happiness, because now we found the closure. The family has the closure. I mean, we were one of the lucky families that got the body and got to bury it. But we never ever thought that we would find out who the killer was. But now that has come true too, which is wonderful for the family.
Far too often, the Mama Wichita Center has been holding these vigils. The city has been called the epicenter for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. Kat Patenaude with Manitoba Métis Federation says identifying a woman's nation is crucial to offer supports to families. Previously, Crystal Saunders has been identified as a member of the Saugeen First Nation. It wasn't until RCMP announced Q's arrest when the community learned she was actually Métis from Winnipeg.
And it's not enough to say somebody's Indigenous. It's great because then we at least know that she's, somewhere within our extended, kinship network. But we need to know it is a broader issue and a broader matter, and it needs to be addressed. It has to be distinctions-based. It has to be that way so that we can provide the culturally appropriate supports that they need.
While the RCMP's work on Saunders' case brings hope to those families that don't have closure, Patenaude says the news reopens old wounds.
I mean, it's resolution to an intensive amount of work by the RCMP, which we thank them for, but it's the beginning of a lot more conversation and a lot more healing.
Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Still in that province, where the funds needed to fulfill a promised search of a Winnipeg landfill remain the subject of questions. It's hoped such a search would locate the possible remains of 2 First Nations women, suspected victims of an alleged serial killer. Elected last October, Manitoba NDP Premier Wab Kinew says he wants that search to start this year, but his government will need federal help to do so, something Ottawa promised a month before the NDP's election. And yesterday, Federal Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hajdu was asked about whether that help was forthcoming. She said that's a question better put to Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Gary Anandasangari.
Listen, this is something my colleague Minister Anandasangari is largely in charge of, but I did meet with Premier Kinew just about 2 weeks ago. It's still a priority for them, and we've reassured Manitoba that we'll work closely with them as they decide how to take those next steps.
The Manitoba chief have a report about the actual search. Should that report be made public?
Listen, you'll have to ask Minister Anandasangari about the mechanisms, but what I would just say is that this will be a complex piece of work, as many reports have indicated, and yet the suffering of the families is paramount for, I think, all of the elected leaders that are working on the issue.
The jury for the Saskatchewan inquest into stabbings on the James Smith Cree Nation and nearby Weldon are ready to make their recommendations. They come after a day and a half of deliberations. And yesterday, the jury gathered for a discussion with media, family members, and those affected by the tragedy. While it's not known what was shared as of airtime last night, we do know they received their instructions from Coroner Blaine Beavan. Now, unlike a trial, the jury in a coroner's inquest do not assign blame. Instead, they recommend ways to prevent similar deaths in the future. Recommendations we'll share on the brief over the coming days. An Edmonton man who pled guilty to manslaughter in the stabbing death of 33-year-old Sherry Gauthier received his sentence yesterday. And it was a late-night attack back in 2020 when Elliot McLeod stabbed Gauthier 3 times in a downtown parking garage following a conversation he'd initiated. The 33-year-old Cree mother of 5 managed to get far enough away to ask for help, but died in hospital shortly thereafter. In his defense, McLeod blamed a history of trauma and methamphetamine addiction, and on Wednesday he was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Factoring in time already served, it means McLeod has 18 months left in his sentence. To Nunavut, where Kimberly Murray, the special interlocutor for missing children and unmarked graves, is in Iqaluit this week, the first such gathering in the Inuit homeland, or Inuit Nunangut. Murray is there to speak with survivors of the territory's 14 residential schools, the last of which, Kavalek Hall, closed in 1996. She's also gathering recommendations on how to protect the graves of children buried on the grounds of those institutions and on ways to conduct searches. One issue, a lack of records on how many kids were taken into the schools or into TB sanitariums in the south. Navalek Dolaganek of Cambridge Bay attended Inuvik's residential school, Stringer Hall.
I'm really honored that I'm still alive to see the work is beginning and to continue doing it all the way until it's all resolved. And my parents and grandparents, they're not alive. But I want to speak for them and to honor them for this. And that I want to congratulate all the leaders and survivors, organizers, to do stuff like this.
And that's your APTN News Brief for Thursday, February 1st. I'm Rick Harp.